Everybody, and welcome to our discussion of the 2020 vintage. We're delighted to have you here this evening, and I'm equally delighted to have our illustrious guest, Jasper Morris, MW, here with me. Not quite with me, I think we're about 7 or 8 miles apart in Burgundy. He's up in his village, in his house in Bouillon, and I'm in Nuit-Saint-Georges, but that's pretty close. Jasper, who at times has been obviously a wine merchant, a wine author, wine critic, wine judge, obviously general Burgundy guru, exceptionnel, and probably now fair to say also a consultant auctioneer, if one is allowed to say that. Welcome, Jasper.
Hello, everybody, and hello, Jason. And yeah, we're not too far away, but I have a glass of wine in my hand and feeling ready to talk. I've only just got back from a day's tasting in the vineyard, so I will try and put out of my mind the reds of Marsanne for a minute and talk about vintage in general.
Absolutely. I briefly mentioned there about being a consultant auctioneer. It would be remiss of me not just to ask you how the Vin de Vin at the Hospice Domaine went this weekend. It sounds quite a lively affair.
Yeah, it was crazy and not really our expectations, because at the moment 2021 doesn't have the cachet of a really top vintage, and indeed won't get the cachet of a really top vintage, so the wines are nice. So we knew that because the volumes were so low that prices would maintain from the high prices of last year, and we expected maybe a small uptick, but in the end the whites sold for double 2020 and the reds were sort of 60% plus. And there was a magnificent sort of coup de théâtre, you could say, when they sold the President's Barrel with this really, really good actor called Pere, can't pronounce his second name, who just got the whole room absolutely enthused, and it went for an easy record. We have messages coming up on the chat. I hope there'll be more. And excellent. Someone got the, oh, good, Nathan, excellent. I didn't know. I didn't see you afterwards. I saw you before. But you managed to get some good wines. Great. Very pleased. Barrel of Domaine, 2 of 70 Auxey. Yeah. So anyway, do keep that chat going to everyone, and then it makes everything more inclusive, I find, on these Zooms if you do that. And welcome to just have a quick flick through the people who've tuned in, and welcome to my many friends who are there tonight.
Before we get going on the very positive news of 2020, it would be sensible just to say a little bit about 2021 in terms of the lack of wine. What are the worst figures that you've heard in discussions with growers?
I mean, some people, I suppose, are down in just about in double figures, sort of 12 or 15 hectolitres a hectare. So yeah, that's really tiny. I mean, nobody is making full crops anymore because of various things that are happening in the vineyards. So no one is talking about hitting the yields which are theoretically allowed. But even so, a good producer is hoping to make 30, 35 hectolitres a hectare in red and maybe 45 to 50 in white. And, you know, they're very far away from that.
Yeah, I think the worst I heard was a Saint-Aubin producer who would normally have made 40 barrels and has made 4.
Yes, not so good.
Yeah.
Oh, well, still, I mean, you know, there's going to be a lot of individual hardship, and then we just have to wait and see what it means for the trade as a whole. I mean, most of us as individuals are perfectly happy to skip a vintage, but you know, you've got to keep the trade filled up. Restaurateurs still, even if they're not going to drink 2021s yet, apart from in bone restaurants where you can't get anything much older than 2019 already. But it does mean there's going to be further pressure.
Let's talk about something more positive. Let's talk about
exactly
vintage, which we both tasted to quite an extent so far. Can you just give a little bit of background on the growing season in 2020?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually very simple. It was very clean and clear. It started very early. It's about the only year since 2016 when in the end there wasn't really any frost risk at all. Temperatures did get quite low, people were prepared, but they didn't have to light the candles or do anything else. So got through the frost all right. Possibly the earliest flowering on record, and that's actually going to be quite important. I'll come to that a little bit later on. Very dry throughout, though fortunately there had been quite a lot of rain during the winter. So I remembered that one of the reasons why the yields were so high, unexpectedly high, in 2018, and that was because of all the winter. So that helped a bit, but it was a dry season. I was hearing comments, mostly from people living far away, saying it sounds like 2003 all over again, but it never felt like that at all, because there weren't any great heat spikes. In 2003, it got immensely hot in June and again in the middle of August. In 2019, there were a couple of spikes when it got really hot, but 2020 was just a very even temperature, and a high temperature, yes, but very even all the way through until perhaps in August, early August, it did get a little bit warmer, but there was never that hideous sort of approaching 40 degrees centigrade. Things stayed in the mid-30s most of the time. So that was helpful. And people were expecting to pick maybe around about the 25th of August, let's say. So before the end of August, so used to be an incredible rarity, no longer the case. And when they came back from their holiday, those who took a holiday, they realized most of them, they had to start earlier. So the first people I know of who started picking, may have been a couple of days earlier, around about the 17th, but let's say typically the 20th was the start on the Côte d'Aubin. And that sounds ridiculously early, but then if you think back to the flowering, it's almost 100 days after the flowering, and that traditionally used to be the signal that things would be ripe 100 days after the midpoint of the flowering. So in the end, the grapes did get their necessary hang time on the vines. It's just that everything happened earlier than usual. So that was the background. Some people, as always, pick early, some people pick late. A case in point was that yesterday I did 7 different visits in Vosne-Romanée. 4 of them had started and finished, pretty much finished in the month of August, and the other 3 didn't start till the 7th or 8th of September. So there were really 2 schools of thought. And some people who waited were waiting in the hope they'd get a bit of rain, but the rain didn't really happen. So that was the picture. Sarah's asked about what were the alcohols, and they're incredibly variable, all over the place. Let's talk about the whites first, shall we, Jason? Is that all right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think they're terrific. There was something I wanted to ask you about the whites. It took me quite a long time to get my head around how they were so fresh.
Yep.
We just talked about heat.
Yes.
They're quite remarkable, and I kept asking vineyards why are they so full of vibrancy and energy. And I wasn't always getting consistent answers. I did wonder. 1 or 2 growers talked about the difference between nighttime temperatures and daytime temperatures. Others denied that there was much difference between the two. Get that break from the heat. So, I mean, you live here. Who is right? Were the evening temperatures that much cooler?
Well, yeah, yes, they were quite a bit cooler, and certainly it wasn't one of those years like 2003 when it was unbearably hot through nighttime as well. So yes, and there was a reasonable differentiation, which certainly helps, which is why you get a very good acidity in things like Vega Sicilia, the Ribera del Duero wines, because even though it's very hot during the day, they're high up, and they get a big diurnal swing in cooler temperatures at night. So yeah, 2020 was probably quite good in that direction. The other factor, I think, is because of the drought, there was frequently a bit of hydric stress, which slightly blocked the development of the vines, almost shut down a bit. And throughout the year, we really only had 2 winds. We had a north wind, which is cold and dry, and a south wind, which is hot and dry. And as a result of that, there was a certain amount of concentration through the wind, which concentrated the sugar, which concentrated the acidity as well, and also the flavors, called the dry extract. So it is a surprise a little bit, and in particular, what's a surprise is that there are no sign in the whites of very ripe flavor profile, which is why I like them a lot. So the profile of the whites is closer to 2017, or perhaps if you picked very early, if you're a sort of a Jean-Marc Rouleau type person, maybe 2014 comes into the picture as well. It's a blend of those two, but rather more of 17, which we think of as the two best white wine vintages, I would say, of the previous 10. So it's all good, but I agree with you, Jason, that we didn't really expect that when we started tasting, and I don't think the producers expected it either. And there was lots of juice in the grapes in the white, which there weren't and wasn't at all in the red. So white yields tend to be very reasonable, not huge, but a lot of producers in sort of Puligny, Chassagne, and so on, we're talking about 50, occasionally 55 hectolitres a hectare, which is really the ideal of where they want to be for the village wines. A little bit less where they got in the Premier Cruise. But it turned out to be, even though the growing season might not have suggested it, it's turned out to be a really textbook vintage in the whites.
The pH seemed very good.
I beg your pardon?
The pHs seem very good overall in white wines.
I missed the first one. The what seems very good?
The pHs.
pHs, yeah. Yes, absolutely. Impeccable. And of course, it's a year in which there was hardly any malic acidity, so that when the malolactic happened, it didn't really drop the acidity. It's really everything you could want. We might just bring in Chablis into conversation, because the summer before, the summer of 2020, when I was tasting 2019s, I was there in July, it did get quite hot in Chablis, probably hotter than the Côte d'Or. And there was a real feeling that everything might dry out and the grapes get scorched. And they were not optimistic at that point. But Chablis is the one region where in mid-August they did get some rain, which got them back on the straight and narrow. And I found the 2020 Chablis better than I expected, and better than 19s, which got a good press. Yeah, that's worked out all right. One or two in the arid site, so up on the plateaus, it did dry out a little bit too much, and you get that pyrazine flavor that's sort of like green grilled hazelnuts almost. So there were just a few of the minor wines which had that, but that's a rarity. That's not typical. And in the Côte d'Or, it's just amazing. I think every single producer I've been to of whites has made good white wines. It's unbelievably consistent.
Do you feel that the level of dry extract is slightly lower than 17, or very, very close indeed?
I don't have a firm opinion on that, but I would put them in the same broad camp. Some of the producers have said that they think they prefer their 17s, I must admit, but not all of them. I have in front of me an Auxey Duresses Les Hautes from Domaine Lafouge, Jean and Gilles Lafouge, which is actually not a domain that I visited. So thank you, Jason, for sending those samples over. But Les Hautes is a favorite vineyard of mine within Auxey Duresses. It's a classic white wine vineyard, more or less north-facing, continuation of Meursault, but fresher, and is a really good place to be. So I haven't tasted it yet, but it's smelling just as good as the others. The alcohol levels in white are never very high. I mean, I haven't tasted much that's hit 14 in white. And I haven't tasted much which has got flavors of still maturity. So most of the whites are 13, 13 and a half. And Stephen's asked about Aligoté, but frankly, yes, Aligoté has fared really well. I've been up in Marseille today, which means I have had a huge range of single vineyard Aligotés from the likes of Sylvain Pataille and Laurent Fournier, and a few other people are doing that as well. I haven't got to yet. And the joy of Aligoté is it really represents terroirs just as well as Chardonnay does. And so it's at 12.5 this year, and the wine's looking gorgeous.
Do you feel somewhere like Auxey Duresses is really well positioned if we continue to get these slightly warmer vintages?
Yeah, I mean, all bets are off if the warming continues exponentially. But where it is now, then Auxey, Duresses, Saint-Romain, perhaps Montley as well, are in a great place, and up in the Haute Côte too.
Yeah. And in terms of longevity, where I mean, it's always a horrible question to have to answer so early in a wine's life. But all things being equal, these 2020 whites look like they could go the distance.
Oh, I think yes, I do think so. But I don't think they're going to be wines which are going to be difficult to taste in their youth, to enjoy in their youth. But I think these will be good long-term aging whites. I mean, everything seems to be in balance for that. So no problem at all. I mean, years like 2009 and 2015, I think to get the best of them, you have to age them for quite a long time. 2014 is, if anything, getting younger and younger as it gets older. So I'm not touching any 2014s now. 2017s are reasonably open and enjoyable, but not showing any signs of undue aging. I think 2020 will follow on the line of 2017. So drinkable early, but with very good potential.
Well, that's very good news. One thing we didn't mention earlier, and we do talk about these 100 days from flowering to harvest. Obviously, with the flowering happening earlier, those 100 days are occurring when there's more sunlight.
Yeah.
Does that mean a more intense ripening period without necessarily the heat causing slow maturity?
Yeah, well, you know, it's the end that makes a difference, really. And one aspect of it is that there's a risk that everything's going to ripen on the same day, which can be problematical just from the logistical point of view. So I have noticed last few years, lots of the more switched on growers have been ordering up, renting big sort of refrigerated lorries in which they can then keep the grapes. So whatever time of day they pick the grapes, and some people nowadays are picking mornings only, but whatever time of day the grapes come in, you can cool them down and then process them in your own good time the following day, or through the evening, whatever. But I think that's quite important. And it makes such a difference to people who've cottoned on to the fact that they've got to be really smart about analyzing each parcel, each plot, and going back and trying them again because they can change. You can have two which are at 12.5 degrees and you think, well, might be ready in 2 days' time. And one of them in 2 days' time is just under 13 and the other is touching 14. So you've just got to go back all the time and keep analyzing them and be prepared to vary your order of picking and certainly be prepared to start the harvest earlier. Yeah.
If you had to take the last 3 vintages, the 18s, 19s and 20s, just talking about whites for the moment, is that a fairly easy order for you to put them in quality-wise?
Easy preference for 20. Most people would put 19 second. I was a little bit less keen on 19 compared to most of my colleagues because I find that is a flavour of surmaturité, of over-ripeness. It's not over-ripeness, it's not anything ugly, but just in terms of what I want, I prefer the fresher style rather than the richer rounder style. And 2019 doesn't really deliver that, but it's beautiful if you prefer the richer rounder style. And 2018, I think we may have undervalued because the yield was very high and it was a very hot summer. And the wines were sound initially, but I have a feeling that they're actually going to build and get better in bottle. And I think we're already seeing that a little bit. But clear preference for 20. And though there's plenty of good wine in 19 and 18, after that, I would go back to 17, some 15s and all of 14s.
Do you think we almost needed 18 and 19 to be able to make such good 20s? Do you think the experience wasn't lost on the growers? And
I don't think that's particularly relevant to the whites. I think it is to the reds. What is interesting is quite how different in both colours these 3 vintages are. You could just brush them off as saying 3 hot, dry vintages, and the wines that have come out of them are completely different in both colours.
You've got another white there, Jasper. Before we move on,
So I have, yeah.
do you want to? I mean, we
finish off my little aperitif there.
Yeah, we picked a couple of whites really from slightly cooler sites to show really what they've achieved in 2020, and hopefully this is another one that has.
Yeah, and you picked two people who are very good, but are not sort of the names that everybody rushes to as soon as an offer comes out. As I say, Lafouge I haven't been to. Rapet I go to every year, and I think he's one of the unsung heroes. I think he's really smart in both colours. He's Vincent Rapet, but he specialises in unfashionable appellations, i.e. all those around Cawthorne plus Bone. This is in fact slightly the riper of the two wines, I would say. It's a Premier Cru vineyard called Caradeux, which is east-facing, but on the hill that's set a little bit further back. So if you were standing in Caradeux, you would be looking at the sort of the curve of the hill of Cawthorne in front of you. And the bottom half is village, and the upper half is village, and the lower half is Premier Cru, and he's in the Premier Cru bit. It's the same idea though. It's just this lovely fruit which gives no suggestion of excess heat. Gideon, we're talking about Vincent Rapet of Domaine Rapet. And the acidities there, the acidities are all natural this year. Nobody's been messing around and adding things in. Whenever I asked producers, what were alcohol levels like, they all said, oh, we didn't need to chaptalize this year. And I would say, actually, I'm asking how high they went, not how low they were. But it's not equal everywhere. But in general terms, 2020 is lower. Most people have 2020s which are lower in alcohol than 2019s. And it does vary. In reds, the picture is much more wide spaced. Anything else you'd like to go on whites, or shall we switch to reds?
No, I think there's plenty to discuss on reds, so let's move over to those.
Okay. Because we've had just Margaret's asked about the fashion for Strack Naturale. That's pervasive in 2020. That's declining anyway, Margaret, and actually good smart work by the producers who are the poster boys for it. They've sort of spotted that they were exaggerating it before the market got tired of it, I would say. And Nathan wants to know which villages should one look out for in the whites. I think Chassaine's done really well, especially the lower ground around Morgeau, which we used to think made rather heavy whites. They're doing well in these dry years. Merceau's in great shape. The only one of the three really famous names that I have slight worries about nowadays is Puligny, because the wines are still very good. You're not getting that very lively floral aspect of the bouquet. They're great in the mouth, but the bouquets are maybe a little bit less exciting in these last few recent hotter vintages. Saint-Aubin, of course, is in great shape until frost of 2021. But Saint-Aubin, which was normally a little bit higher in acidity and so on and so forth, is looking very good in 2020. Yeah.
Would your view on Puligny, would that stretch from village through Premier Cru all the way up to Grand Cru?
No, it's more village. Yeah. I'd say that's that comment is aimed more at the villages. Yeah. And Renato wants to know if the vintage favours oxidative or reductive style producers. I don't get too fussed about that. I'm not sure that vintages necessarily follows through. I mean, yes, you have your house style, which goes one way or the other. But the comment I made earlier on, which has really surprised me, is that every cellar I've been to, I've liked the whites. So it's working pretty much equally in both. Okay, red time.
Pinot Noir.
Yeah. So we had a couple of questions earlier on, which I avoided because they're specific about the reds. So to begin with, normally I like to start tasting the new vintage about a year afterwards. So I try and start tasting the very end of September and into the beginning of October. But this year, nobody wanted to until after the 10th of October was the first time I could get any tastings. Partly the harvest was a bit later in 2021, and partly everybody was completely knackered by all the work they had to do to deliver decent 21s. And a strong point for Burgundy here is just how much everybody really kept at it. Nobody dodged the issue. It was a complicated growing season 2021. And they were still doing their last treatments of the vines into the first week of August. So people were either cancelling holidays or sending the family away and hoping to join them and not being able to. But I just saw these completely wiped out, exhausted producers at the beginning of July. So they hardly got any holiday. And they weren't really ready to receive people until they got their equilibrium back. So I started tasting in the Côte de Beaune from about the 10th of October. And to begin with, I really hated the reds, partly because if you're tasting 3 or 4 reds after somebody's 15 whites, and they're much more white wine people, then it may be they didn't get it right, or they chose to privilege in the picking the white wines, and the reds have to look after themselves. But in the Côte de Beaune, I think the balance is more difficult, and the heat of the year has shown more often. It is not universal by any means. There are some utterly great and gorgeous red wines in the Côte de Beaune, but it was a bit more difficult. And you did see a few 15 and a half, and everybody said, yes, but they stayed fresh. And here's an important point. Let's spend a moment, if I may, in discussing about ripeness and picking dates. Because you've got these two schools of thought, one of whom says, it's going over the top, we've got to pick. And in 2020, that was obvious. And 2 people I'm close to, Ludovine Griveau at the Hospice de Beaune and Dominique Lafont, both of them started picking earlier than they wanted to, because they felt that some of the leaves were dying. This is again more true of Côte de Beaune than Côte de Nuit. And therefore they wouldn't be pumping, the vines couldn't be pumping any more goodness into the grapes. They were up 13.5 alcohol already, frightened that the acidity might die down if they left the grapes unpicked. And they both started picking reds first from around about sort of 17th, 20th of August, and they weren't happy to do so. They knew that the skins weren't completely physiologically ripe, but there's a compromise to be made. And these are smart people, and they said that's a compromise we're prepared to make. And because the skins aren't completely ripe, we're going to back off on the extraction so that we don't get anything ugly into the wines. So that was one school of thought. The other school of thought says, but monsieur, we can't pick until everything is ripe. It's the most important thing, physiological ripeness. And that's what came around with those 2 schools I was talking about in Vosne Romanée, one who picked in August and the other who picked one in September. And they said, and it doesn't really matter degrees, and in any case with us, the degrees don't get too high and blah, 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 but you have to have physiological ripeness. And if everything is balanced, then we can accept 14 or 14.5% alcohol. Well, sometimes it ran away and got more than that. But the other thing that you've got to factor in is, what is the flavor profile? Is it still a Pinot flavor profile, or is it completely black fruit? And that's an issue which the late pickers, I think, don't take into account sufficiently. Now, I'll lay on the line at the start that my own palate and temperament probably prefers, more often than not, the slightly earlier pick, fresh, energetic, still a bit of a mineral feel, if we're allowed to say that, and based around red fruit rather than black fruit. Because I personally believe that if you have an overripe grape, that's going to stay in the wine forevermore. If you have a slightly underripe grape, that will sort itself out with aging in bottle later on. The wines won't be as attractive in their youth, but they'll get there later. And after all, if you don't accept that slightly underripe grapes can make good wine in Burgundy, then you wouldn't have had a single good wine between 1959 and 1990, for example, which would be a worrying thing, and certainly was not the truth. So that's my take, and I do accept that it is one opinion, and you can have, it's perfectly valid to say, no, we want to wait for the grapes to be riper. And you will know which wines that you personally like, and you take your decisions from there. So I was finding things all over the place in the 2020 Côte de Beaune reds, but with some wines I liked a lot. Some cellars were variable, some worked better, some worked less well. Questions about stems earlier on, I think from Sarah. It's quite interesting. Mostly people are saying, aha, 2020 is so ripe, stems are ripe, let's use more. Some people said, despite the ripeness, that blockage from the hydric stress means that the stems didn't ripen quite as much as the fruit did, so we'll be a bit careful. And other people said, because the acidity levels are already not too high, and our grapes are ripe and the rest of it, there's a risk of an imbalance between ripeness of fruit and acidity. And one of the things that does happen when you use lots of stems, even though the wines taste fresher, you actually are removing acidity from them. And they were worried about the risk of Brettanomyces if they use stems. Because it's also true that if you have stems in the vat at the top, you do have a little bit more of a risk of bacterial spoilage if you're not really, really careful what you're doing. So there are a few who backed off for that reason. Otherwise, most people who do stems went full steam ahead, and some people who only use a little used rather more. So the tendency for 2020 was on the whole, but not invariably, more stems. Certainly not in 2021. Now, when I taste these reds, I find that the wines are incredibly intense anyway. Maybe I'll just park the stems and I'll reintroduce that later on, or remind me if I don't. So first tasting the reds, you're stunned by how deep the colors are. Everything's intense, and those colors came out on virtually day one of the time in the vat. Unbelievably easy to extract things. So almost everybody backed off on the extraction, use this wretched word. I just did an infusion. A few people who always do the punching down continue to do it, and I don't find those wines over tough and over tannic. But the people who continue with punching down, I think, do it in a much gentler fashion than used to be the case. So people went for relatively or even very light forms of extraction, and you can't begin to see that in the wines because naturally the year just gave everything right from the start. Now, tasting the wines in barrel, sometimes they come over as these massive blockbusters and you can't quite see where the detail is. They appear to be very good wines, but you're not quite sure. And sometimes they come over with much greater grace and elegance and detail. The first thing that makes a difference, and it's a question I ask in every cellar I taste in, is what stage are you at? And the people who have left the wines in barrel and haven't racked at all, which is the tendency these days for people not to rack until they take them out of barrel. I'm not convinced by that, but that is now the standard here. Those wines were the more opaque to try to read wines. And the people who had racked, and this became really obvious in cellars where some wines are racked and some are not racked, the wines which are racked just had so much more expression. And after a while, I began to realize that this is potentially a great vintage, really great vintage for the successful wines. But it won't be all the wines. Well, it certainly won't be all the producers, and it won't be all the wines in any one cellar. So it's not just going to be a pile in and buy everything, but where the wines have been got exactly right, then it's as great as anything I know. Really, really fabulous. And I think coming back to the stems, typically, it's not just a question of the length of the wine after you've finished it and sort of spat it out, and then you get that aftertaste, but just the whole of the wine on the palate, all the time it's in your mouth, it just seems to stretch it out and pull it out and make it longer. And I just found so much more definition in the wines where a proportion at least of stems have been used. But again, please accept when I say this, that I am, relatively speaking, a pro-stem person. Right, that's the end of that little...
One question there, Jasper. In terms of the gentler vinification that growers are allowed to adopt due to the wines being so giving in their colour and their structure, has that helped accentuate our definition in what is, sometimes in the heat of a vintage, you can lose that sense of what makes each vineyard so special.
No, not okay. So only the wines I was talking about to begin with, which hadn't yet been racked, you couldn't necessarily see it all, but everything which was sort of readable, the terroir definition is superb. It's not at all better than in 19, for example, where I think that the heat of the vintage shows in the flavor profile, In 2020, the heat of the vintage shows in the massive concentrated wines, but not really in the flavor profile. Now, you've kindly sent me a Lafouge and a Rapet red as well. So we got an Auxey, Duresses, Premier Cru, Climat du Val, which will please my friend Rafi, who's listening in and has already made a plug for the reds from Lafouge. And then I've got the Ile-de-Vergelesses, Vergelesses, Premier Cru from Rapet. So,
I wasn't sure if he was going to send you eel or lay, so that's very generous of him.
It's eel I've got.
Yeah.
Yeah. The good one. Not that the other isn't very nice. Let's just say the special one. A wine which I prefer to many a Corton. So, I mean, it's one thing I would also say is it's for most people, it's a vintage which is going to need a really long élevage. So many people haven't racked yet when they normally would have done, and will bottle much later. Two exceptions on that. One was, though the former might change, this one, Dominique Lafont felt that he felt that maybe some of his 2005s, he possibly extracted a little bit too much, and that there's a risk in the hot dry vintage that they might dry out too much in barrel. So he doesn't want to do that in 2020. So at the moment, he's thinking about a slightly shorter élevage, but he hasn't acted on it. And the other is Domaine de la Romanée Conti, who have already taken the wine out of barrel and are preparing all their great Grand Crus for bottling. Their reasoning is interesting. It's very old-fashioned, but not necessarily wrong for that. Is that the old idea for the élevage is something that you only counted from the moment the malolactic had finished, and then you counted maximum of 12 months for the élevage after malolactic. And at DRC and some other domains, the malolactics were very, very early in 2020, i.e. around about Christmas time. And so Aubert de Villaine has therefore sort of decided to have all their wines pulled out of barrel and prepared for bottling. Most other people are extending them further and further. Julia asked about the oak aging regime, and the tendency at the moment anyway is to use less new oak. But you get wines like this when they express themselves so much, they just don't need any additional oak. So most people will either be the same as usual, or a few people will be a bit less than usual. Having said which, given that it's a much smaller crop than they expected, because when they came to press the grapes for the reds, they discovered there was so little juice inside. And normally you calculate something like 315, 320 kilos of grapes in order to make a barrel of wine. And this year you needed 360 kilos to get to your barrel. So it's sort of, it gives you an indication of how much less juice there is than normal in it. So it's possible some people have ordered up more barrels than they were actually would have expected to, than in fact they needed when it came to getting their juice. But there's no particular oak direction one way or another. So,
do you ever feel, Jasper, of what the wines will do post-bottling? I mean, they have a lot of matière. So I found very little dryness on most of the wines. It's hard to imagine they're shut down in the same way as, say, 2005, for example.
They might. Because again, with the reds, we do have variation. What's interesting is that those which are highest in alcohol, they have this very rich fruit. They do have some acidity, which sort of keeps them seemingly fresh. And I think they will be that much less fresh later on. And but the third aspect is a lot of them have, I haven't yet found the word in English to describe the tannins, but you go from underripe, you get hard tannins, ripe, you get fine grained tannins, overripe, the tannins suddenly become rough and ugly and sort of crumbly is a word that's occurred to me, but I don't know if that idea will get across. And that I'm seeing. So whereas the whites seem to me to be intrinsically balanced pretty much everywhere, The reds, it's not the case. So the upside that I was sort of talking about when I was talking about how much I enjoyed some of the reds is a very high upside, but really, 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 and I'm going to try and bring these out in my tasting notes. So those of you who are subscribers to JMIB, Jasper Morris Inside Burgundy, or those of you who are about to become subscribers, you will get, I haven't worked out how many wines will be in the end, but 2,500, 3,000 wines from this 2020 vintage. I'm going to try this year and extend my views so that there will be more negatives as well as all the positives. And I'm going to have many more of my 5-star top end wines, I think, in 2020. But I'm also going to have more of the sort of 2-star, this hasn't made it wines. Because there are plenty, even from good people, where I have a question mark about the balance of the wine. So even so, I mean, it's pretty massive. The tannins are certainly going to be there. Because they're ripe, you don't taste them too much. It's not impossible that this vintage will close down more than 19s, for example, and more than 15s. So Tom, I won't get the Côte de Beaune should come out before the end of the year, possibly before Christmas Eve, if not between Christmas and the New Year. And the Côte de Nuit notes will come out very shortly after that. And Stephen, not much more. Sure, the amphory in clay, sometimes terracotta, and sometimes in what they call grès, earthenware. Yeah, I mean, more and more people have got 1 or 2 to play with, but there's not much significant movement in terms of somebody just using that. Right. So, what else would you like me to comment on, Jason, on the reds?
I think we mentioned about the whites, the comparison with 18, 19, and 20. It's the same comparison on the reds. Of those vintages, did you find the 18s in reds showed the most heat?
Here in the reds, it is amazing how different it is. Some people said, oh, the 18s are horrible, but the balance is fine in 19s. I mean, 20s are all right. Others, 18 were high in alcohol, 19 was higher, and 20 was higher still. One producer who I think you don't work with in Flagey-Echezeaux, who when I tasted last year and tasted some 15.5s and commented on it, he said, oh, well, come back next year and it'll be 16.2. So thus far, I haven't booked to go back, but I probably ought to, because it's quite famous. Anyway, it is an uneven picture insofar as that different people seem to work differently for them across the 3 vintages. Probably most often 19 was the highest in alcohol. Probably most often 18 was the one which was most affected by the hot dry conditions, because you had more bacterial spoilage in 18 and you had more volatility in the wines. Having said which, the people who didn't have bacterial spoilage and didn't have volatility, and of course that's the majority, I really loved their 18s. I thought they were magical wines, and I didn't find too much of sort of hot vintage flavor in the fruit profile. 19, there was very much less spoilage going on, and the fermentations went through very much more easily for most people. But I did find the flavor of not cooked, but certainly quite warm fruit. In 2020, I want to reinforce this idea, but there is something of everything. And it is going to be a question of reading the notes quite carefully in 20 and checking to see if it's your style of wine. And there are some people who've actually made some wines which are still quite elegant, very much in red fruit, not too dark in color, and are classical wines. Others have made some brilliant wines in a deeper, richer, more powerful style, but still balanced. And a third group have also made very good wines, but for me, they're a little bit too rich, and the fruit is a little bit too much showing the sunshine. And then there are more other people again, where the wines are clearly unbalanced and not good news.
Did you feel if someone is farming organically or biodynamically, that has had a positive effect in 2020 or a negative one?
I mean, okay, so I'm a fan of biodynamics, and I've been in favour of the concept of it. 2020 is the first time I've seen a vintage in which it seems to have been a clear bonus insofar that several of the people who had the best yields of famous growers who are not trying to have high yields, but where they had the least loss, and I'll cite two who sadly I think may not be yours, but Lafouge in Volnay and Rossignol-Trappet in Gevrey-Chambertin, they both had yields in sort of 40 hectares a hectare, and an effortless sense of balance throughout, and alcohol levels of sort of 13.2, 13.5, perfectly where you want them. I haven't finished. I've done most of my Côte Domaine tastings, but I've still got a lot more to do in the Côte Nuit. Haven't done anybody yet in Marais Saint-Denis or Chambord-Musigny. Done some in most of the other villages, but those would be two examples of biodynamic producers where it's really worked. But by and large, the sort of narrative that's in most people's minds that if you're organic, biodynamic, you're bound to make less of a crop, doesn't seem to be the case in 2020 at all. So let's talk a little bit about which regions, sub-regions have done well in the reds. I think if we start right up in Chablis land, in the red wine satellite villages, I think those over towards Tonnerre, like Épinoy, and also probably fine towards Auxey in the Côte d'Auxerre, they're fine. The grapes ripen perfectly. There's still plenty of juice in them. They're great. Auxey, I don't know if you've worked with anybody in Auxey, Jason, but there it's an area where you're on these steep arid slopes, and they had tiny yields, and I slightly worry about the future of that appellation if we're going to get more hot, dry years. Moving south, I haven't done wide tasting in the Côte Chalonnaise, so I'm not going to comment there. Côte de Beaune, it was a little bit more of a struggle for sure, but I got less of a feeling in, you may remember for 2018, I was worried about Volnay, and I definitely found some vineyards which had dried out before the grapes had got right. I mean, so the flavors got too ripe, but the structure hadn't got ripe enough. So you got overripe grapes with underripe tannins, and that could be really ugly and very dry in parts of Volnay in 2018. It's less the case in 2020, and I think that is referring again to a comment somebody asked earlier. I think there is an issue, a positive feeling with the Pinot Noir is that the vines are beginning to learn the new rules, and I found that the excess of heat or drought affected a little bit less in 2020 than it probably had in 2018. Pommard again has played a blinder. I've still got a few more visits to do there, but those are typically more humid soils, so they don't mind drought conditions as much. Pommard's really good. Again, I still got to do a bit more tasting in the sort of the side valley vineyards, Saint-Romain, Auxey, Duresses, and so on. But in general, those cooler places, the oak codes have done very well. They were getting 12.5. They were getting 13 natural, which probably never really happened. What else have I done? Nothing else in Côte de Beaune strikes me as problematic. Had some good results around the hill of Courton. Very good results in Savigny-les-Beaunes. Moving to Côte Nuit, I haven't yet finished tasting in Nuit, and some of the producers I've tasted in Nuit have been fine, but I've seen in the Gaussillons, when you taste a whole range up and down the Côte, if there's one village that's got a bit out of control and definitely a little bit overripe, it has been Nuit Saint-Georges. But this is often the case. The growers who are based there are more on top of it, and I think that is less often the case. I can't really speak much about Chambord and Moret. Had some good results in Gevrey. Once you get up as far as Marcenay, in particular, it got pretty dry, and they have some soils which are very dry and a little bit more problematic. But the parts of Marcenay which are not on the alluvial river soils were looking very good today, I thought. We have a little question from Sarah saying about water was key. Yes, water remains key. And that's a long-term thing. That's not just about any one vintage. From here on, water is going to be key. And the basic water table, the nappe phréatique in French, in general is fine because we've had enough water during the winter. But that operates for the lower lying vineyards, and up at the top of the hills, there are certain appellations where you get little springs high up, a bit in top of Puy-de-Dôme, certainly in Marange, one or two other places. And those higher up vineyards are the ones which are really in danger of drying out. So we're going to have to monitor those for the future. Yeah.
Do you think we're right on the limit of what Pinot Noir and Chardonnay can cope with?
Pinot Noir, yes. Chardonnay, no, because we know you can make great Chardonnay in many parts of California, Australia, and the rest of it. The Chardonnay, as I've said before, is basically a weed that will grow anywhere, and it does change the style, but it works anywhere. You can have great Chardonnays at 11.5, 12 degrees, and you can have great Chardonnays at 15 degrees. Pinot, for me, I'm happier at 12.5 than I am at 13.5, except at the top vineyards. And I'm certainly happier in sort of the low 13s than I am at 14 plus. And I definitely don't want to know about it at 15.5. It's more at risk, Pinot, for sure. Growers are being pretty impressive in the way that they're trying to tackle this, and they haven't lost morale. One or two have thrown their hands up and sort of put their aprons over their head and said, 5 years' time, we'll all be out of business. But that's rare. Most of them are working hard. What sort of rootstocks are we going to plant? What sort of Pinot material are we going to put in the ground? Because they're having to do an awful lot of replanting because of this rootstock issue, the 161-49 rootstock, which is giving up the ghost in any recent plantations. And viticulture is changing as well, but I mean, it's not really the point of this evening to go into all those changes, all the big issues of climate change and viticultural changes. We haven't got time to do that tonight. It's more about the 2020 vintage. Yeah, that would be my...
I wrote something this afternoon where I said, is 2020 a great vintage? And I still don't know from red wines. It's certainly full of great wines. Is that probably the best way to sum it up? There are some...
Yeah, I mean, I certainly went through a phase of thinking, I'm hating these 2020 reds, but that was pretty early on and much more Domaine based. And I thought the great wines were more of an exception. And then I've started to change my mind. And I had a couple of days when I thought, bloody hell, these are great. And there are moments when you do have to take into account the extraordinary intensity of these wines, which means that you can actually pass over them and just think that they're, it's a hot vintage and it's too powerful. And then you realize that what you have just finished tasting doesn't feel unbalanced at all at the end. And it's just that there is such an intensity that they're only vaguely beginning to show what they're about. And I really didn't feel that in 2019, and you wouldn't have either, I don't suppose. And there were lovely, lovely wines, beautiful wines, very, very good wines. But I think there is something, the 2020s which work, I think is a whole another level again. I think the proportion which do work, and I'm not yet ready to put a figure on that proportion, I think will be legendary wines.
I think that's probably a very good place to end the discussion, actually.
all the wines of the Flint Wines portfolio, clearly.
Well, I think people obviously be bursting with anticipation to read your tasting notes, Jasper. Can you just tell them again how they can do that and subscribe to your site?
Yeah, it's great. I mean, if you Google Inside Burgundy, you might get a reference to my book, or you might get a reference to the site, but it is www.insideburgundy.com.
Great, and we recommend everyone subscribes. Thank you so much, Jasper. It's fascinating to hear your take on this. Probably unique vintage is probably the best way to describe it, both for reds and whites. What a lot of pleasure we're going to get drinking them over the next 30, 40 years, I guess.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Thank God we're all so young.
Oh, thank God. Yes, absolutely. Well, I'd just like to say thank you, and I'm also fascinated by all the people who have all sorts of names from past and present in my life. So I'm really good to see you all here tonight, and thank you for following through. And we will stay in touch and continue to enjoy good Burgundy for as long as we possibly can.
Great, thank you, Jasper.